Tonight, a system that's been called the greatest property scandal of our time. The Memo starts right now. And a very good evening to you. Welcome to The Memo. I'm Kaylem Shepherd. Tonight, we're breaking down one of the biggest property scandals of our time. You finally think that you've saved up all this money to buy your own flat. Yes, Mum, Dad, I've done it. I can buy my own flat. But did you know that there's a landlord on top of you? Did you know that you're going to be subjected to unknown costs, unknown service charge? Is that fair? And why is the UK one of the last, if not the last country in the world that is wrapped up in this scheme? Surely that's not fair. It's not fair for you to work all your life to buy a flat, to then have a landlord on top of you. You don't own a brick in that flat. That's not fair. That's not right. And the system is broken. I'm now joined by Harry Scoffin to discuss more on this. Harry, thank you very much for joining me here on The Memo. You're a housing campaigner and you're the founder of Free Leaseholders. Appreciate your time. You describe the leasehold system as a scam. Why?
So we are unique in the world. In England and Wales, when you buy a flat, it's normally a flat. There are situations with houses, but normally it's a flat. When you buy that flat, there is a landlord. Now, home ownership, to most people's mind, would give you dignity, autonomy and control, and most importantly, security. But with leasehold, you've got someone else calling the shots in your own home. Now, obviously, our generation, I'm 30, I live at home with my mum and sisters. We live in a leasehold flat, so we see it daily. But the fact is that we have to live, our generation, under landlords. But isn't it crazy that you spend your life savings on the biggest purchase of your life and you still can't get rid of a landlord? You're enslaved to a landlord. That's not right. And the fact is, this landlord is far more powerful than anything you ever see in the private rented sector, because they control the value of your home, of your investment. If those service charges go too high, the value of it goes down. And you've got next to no control over that situation. And that's a nightmare. And the rest of the world, many of our former colonies, as soon as they got rid of us lot, the first thing they did was to abolish leasehold.
Yeah, I appreciate I appreciate where you're coming from, but people did sign those leases. They did sign, those agreements. So, what would you say to them? They did sign into this system.
Well, what about the sub postmasters? They were told they signed a contract, and then they were being defrauded. And the whole establishment is set up, the legal establishment, the property establishment, and the politicians, to crow and say, well, you did sign a contract. And the fact is, when a product is causing so much harm, and we represent people that are on beta blockers, antidepressants, suicidal ideation, when something is causing that much harm, the society and the government needs to say, actually, we're getting rid of it. And you look at so many other industries, gambling, big tobacco, oil, governments come in and say, we don't want that here. We're getting rid. And hopefully we're getting that to that position where we've got this new Labour government. They were elected to power expressly on a manifesto to end this thing. So obviously so many governments promise to get rid of it. They get lobbied, then time runs out, and they might bring forward a bill at the last minute before an election, but it's very thin.
Yeah. Harry, take me back to the beginning. What was life for you? I think I read online that you said here as well that you live with your sister, your mum. It was your mum's flat that caused an issue. Take me back to that time.
Absolutely. So my mum's been a leaseholder now for 10 plus years. She bought the flat. The service charges were okay at the beginning, but then they've gone through the roof. So this is a 3-bed flat. There's no swanky services like a gym, swimming pool, garden or anything like that. And the service charges now are at such a level where you can't sell the property. So it's £33,000 a year. And the freeholder... The service charge.
Goodness me. What's that going to?
Well, supposedly buildings, insurance and all the rest. But the fact is we've got a building with lifts that don't work, windows that don't get washed, more leaks than a tea bag. And the freeholder is one of Britain's richest men, a billionaire, in a tax haven in Monaco. That, for me, isn't right. And when I see something that's not right... Yeah. I can't wait for other people to change it. I've got to get involved. And absolutely, I've got a vested interest. I'm the son. I'm seeing what my mum's going through, having no control over the biggest purchase of her life. But I know that this is affecting 5.3, households, million households in England, Wales. And the fact is, you've got all these other groups that have been there for years. And I think you see this on so many other policy areas. When you read up about other injustices, what government does is it tends to co-opt those groups. So you need to have a group that's the outsider, that is holding
You're the
power to
outsider.
account. Well, our group is absolutely free leaseholders, because it's not just me. Even though I may be the figurehead, we've got a brilliant team around me. They're leaseholders as well, but they're volunteers. They've got full-time jobs. So I'm in a very lucky position where I can do this 7 days a week, but it is exhausting. But I've got a great group of people around me. And obviously they would never come publicly, because this is a multi-billion pound industry. And they will go to extreme lengths to not only smear but destroy you. So, you know...
Has that happened to you?
There's definitely been influence ops campaigns smearing against me and the campaign to MPs, civil servants, and you can never fully put your finger on it, but it's clearly coming from people that have got a vested interest, that are finding this so lucrative. And what you've just got to do is keep going and actually showing the value you're creating, putting pressure on the government. And I'll give you an exclusive here. So when the government made an announcement on the 21st of November, where they kicked the can down the road for another 4 to 5 years, saying it's all complicated. We were the only group that stood up. And I have to give tribute to Matthew Wright on LBC, because he was the only journalist that got the story. All of the other journalists, and it's so angering, because I grew up in Singapore, which is like an authoritarian regime, where the media is completely controlled and managed. And yet it seems to be that way in this country too. Matthew Wright got the story, his producer got in touch and said he wants to cover it. But the rest of the media were talking up can kicking as delivery.
And why do you think you describe the media as ignoring it? Why? Why is that? Because they have a vested interest in it?
Sometimes it's a combination of it is a complex issue and getting people that are willing to explain it and break it down.
Advertisers?
Probably a bit of that as well. But I think it's also that there is just so much money in it, and editors will know freeholders. They'll know people that are involved in that game, developers and all the rest of it. But beyond that, this is a multi-generational scandal. This is going back to the 1880s. I mean, everyone goes on about feudal, but literally there's been moves in Parliament to get rid of this thing since the 1880s. And when we talk about enfranchisement, giving people the right to vote, this is actually a civil rights issue. Because for many years, leaseholders had no right to vote because they're not a property owner.
Of course.
But the exclusive that I wanted to give you is that when we came out and said this is not the change that people voted for at the election, this is not an insurgent government of delivery, this is a government of more of the same, just like the Tories, sucking up to the deep-pocketed vested interests. I got a Labour MP who came into my WhatsApp trying to intimidate me one evening. Now, obviously, he's now apologised. I'm not going to name him on the show. I believe in second chances. But if that is the calibre of the people that we're bringing to Parliament, when you've got a campaign group that cares about inequality, about putting something right, just because we didn't toe the line, you don't have that behaviour.
Of course.
And the fact is that this is what we had with the Tories. We're having it now with Labour. But I think we're starting to cut through. So the government basically has accelerated some of the reforms just a few weeks ago after we had gone on to the Lewis Goodall show. And I basically got a machine gun out and attacked the government.
Did.
I didn't want to do it.
You had to, though.
Yeah, but you have to sometimes. If no one else is making a scene, you have to do that. And then the weekend after, the Housing Minister, Matthew Pennycook, has to have something good to announce on the media rounds. But it's so upsetting because Labour promised change. They promised to get rid of the system. And this is such a win for them. Actually, the people on the other side of this are the most hated in the society. When you look at opinion polls, many independent surveys are showing huge public support for getting rid of the system. So, yes, the government say it's complicated, but don't sound like the Tories, who had 14 years and kept telling us it was complicated, and then they gave us something rather modest at the end. Actually show that you can be a disruptor. Because you know what? If you can't disrupt, people will turn to more radical politics. And Reform put it in their manifesto. Just before I've come on the show today, Jeremy Corbyn's put out a letter on it. So people will go to the political extremes if they don't feel the incumbent parties are going to do what's right for the people. And I think that's the key thing. It does sound like a sort of Brexit rerun about the elites and the people, but it's so important because this is something that successive governments have promised to get rid of. including Margaret Thatcher, for goodness sake, in the late 80s, and then they don't do it. I've got a document that the Labour Party's deleted called An End to Feudalism. When I was 1 year old in 1995, there was a guy called Nick Rainsford, who I think's still out there, and also the late Frank Dobson. It was one of the first documents Tony Blair signed off as the leader of the Labour Party. They committed to all new flats being common hold, which is a much better system. They were then in power for 13 years.
You argue.
We argue.
Some people would argue that it's not the best system. Let's dive into this leasehold, common hold. What is a leasehold to some of our viewers that don't know what it is?
So a leasehold is a time-limited right to occupy a property, usually a flat. So it's a tenancy. And with a tenancy, you have a landlord. And you have all the vulnerabilities of being a tenant. So that landlord has basically full control over the property. Yes, you have rights. Yes, there are restrictions on what the landlord can and can't do. But generally, if you have a bad landlord, all the laws in the world won't stop them from plundering your pocket, basically, and reducing the value of your home. And I think that's a big thing. And after Grenfell, because it's really important, because to understand what's happened in recent years is that obviously 72 people lost their lives, and it set off a wider debate about, well, are there other blocks of flats in the country that are unsafe with dangerous cladding, or they have other fire safety defects? And then there was this whole panic because so many of them were built unsafely in the first place. But then there was a debate. It went back to leasehold, and it was like, who should pay? Should it be the building owner or should it be the leaseholders, the tenants? And obviously the building owners are going, we're not really building owners. We just have a small bit of value in the block. The leaseholders, they've paid a premium, they own it, so they should pay. Then the leaseholders and campaigners were like, hang on a second, mate. For all these years, you've been creaming off us. You can't now say you're not the building owner. You know, if you're not a building owner, get out of our home and give us the freehold. You can't have your cake and eat it. And then that's sort of a wider debate about actually the rest of the world deal without freeholders, you know, these owners of the buildings, income streams. Why do we need it? And obviously now, all these years later, we're still having that debate. I think the really important thing is that we have a system called common hold. It never really took off. It was introduced by the Blair government in the early 2000s. But developers obviously worked out that they can make so much more money with leasehold than common hold. So common hold never sort of took off. But this Labour government have said that all new flats would be common hold and that they'd make common hold the default tenure.
But do you think common hold didn't take off because investors didn't believe in it?
Absolutely. But the fact is...
So if we haven't got the investors backing, then where are we going to go from there, Harry?
The fact is...
We need the banks and the investors.
To an extent, because we need to be thinking about serving the people. And the fact is, leasehold is pure rent seeking. People are taking money out of the real economy. They're charging for services that were never delivered. This is not buccaneering capitalism, people taking a risk, taking a punt. These are people that, you know, people would say is the unacceptable face of capitalism. They're not delivering anything and they've hitched a ride on your home, and it's immoral. And, you know, the fact is, government is a very powerful thing. Parliament is a very powerful thing. If they want to get rid of it, they can, and they should. And I think the key thing is common hold. Yes, and I want to make it clear here, residents will fall out of each other. That is a fact of life, but most won't, because you know what? If everyone is invested in their home, they want to maintain its value. That means putting money into the block to maintain it well.
But how would that work? How does that look?
So you have a common hold association, which is basically a company that everyone that owns a flat is a member of. But obviously, not all of you are going to be involved in the day-to-day running. So you'll then elect.
You elect.
You elect some of your neighbours. You know, most high-caliber ones. You know, people ideally with professional backgrounds. Maybe they're accountants. Maybe they've got finance background. Maybe they're a lawyer. Fantastic. You elect them every year, and they are then the ones that liaise with the managing agent. Now, the managing agent is the one that does all the work. And if you're not happy with them, you are like Alan Sugar on The Apprentice, and you say you're fired. And it's a much cleaner system. And that is what they've got in Scotland and the rest of the world. You know, even countries that are less economically developed than us, they are first world when it comes to flat living. Even countries where they chop off people's hands, they actually have a fairer democratic system of flat living. And yet here, and I think this is where you do have to have that international perspective, the way we talk about leasehold in England is that it's the only way we've done it, it has to carry on. Actually, let's not be little Englanders. Let's get with the programme. Let's look to the rest of the world. But I'm saying something here that is not radical. Most of the work's been done by the Law Commission over half a decade ago. And that was itself extensively consulted upon and researched. They basically dealt with civil servants in Australia, Singapore, faster growing economies where they've cracked it.
Yeah.
Even America, condominium. Italy, Thailand, condominium. Europe, they call it co-ownership sometimes. Yes, people fall out, but it's a little bit like Winston Churchill. Democracy is the worst system, except for all others that have been tried. And I think that's so wrong that one person who might not even be paying tax in this country is taking out as much money as they want from the block of flats, and you're literally living under their rule. And actually, I'd much rather have my neighbours. Yes, there'll be some tough decisions, some tough conversations. Yes, people might have tensions, but that's better because we're all invested in the single biggest purchase of our lives. And if you're not happy with your neighbours, you get rid of the board.
You said to Lewis Goodall on LBC that you urge parents not to give their child money or children money to invest in, a leasehold. Some people would say, hey, I just want to get my foot on the property ladder.
Don't. It's a really bad investment and you will come to regret it. So data has come out recently from Hamptons, the estate agents, where they've said that for those people that have bought a house, the growth of that property comes much quicker than a flat. And unless you want to be trapped in a flat, do not buy. If you are ever thinking, I know with the cost of living, it's so high at the moment, and tuition fees and everything adds up, you might not even think you would ever have children. But even if there's a hint that you may have them, do not get chained to a flat, because then you'll be stuck and you will not be able to get a bigger property. And actually, people that have got a house, if you want the same growth that they get in 10 years, you've got to wait 20 years if you have a leasehold flat. And that isn't sustainable. And, and it's funny, after I made those comments, I had and it's good because I've got this LinkedIn where you can see who's checking you out. And they're all developers. All of these PR people for developers, they're worrying.
We don't want him.
Well, we don't want him. We want to take him out. And the fact is that I think
if you're not here next week, we know
what's happened, exactly. And it's not a laughing matter because they've got all these lobbyists that are paid good amounts to go out and actually try and brief producers, brief politicians, brief civil servants to say, actually, no, this isn't right. And I think, you know what? I'm going to strike a pro-developer tone now. They can make lots of money off common hold. The fact is, that will be a product that people will want. People will buy into that because of a house. You buy a house. If the roof needs repairing, you make the decision. You choose the contractor. You don't go to let some random offshore monkey go and choose which company. And you know what they'll normally choose? They'll choose a company that they own to make as much money off the repairs. And also, if you can't afford it this year, with a house, you can delay it to next year. You can't do that in leasehold. It's just to the whims of the freeholder. It's not a good system. And the fact is that if anything goes wrong, you have to spend your life being a litigator in tribunal. That isn't right. Most people have not got the time, money, or emotional energy to put up and go up against these guys who've got the best lawyers money can buy.
Where do you get your energy from, talking about energy? You seem very passionate. Obviously you told me where this stems from, but what keeps you going?
I think
what's success for you?
I think the thing is knowing that this is so much bigger than me. And there's been moments where I just think, I've been doing this for now, nearly a decade. I worked at a charity that was doing it. And then I thought, you know what? They did great work for many years, but almost became too part of the system, I felt. And I just felt, there's a young guy who's he's not that young now, but Kwejo Tweneboa really inspired me because I saw what just one guy was doing with energy, passion, as you say, and whipping out an iPhone, holding housing association landlords and local authority landlords to account. And I thought, you know what? I don't need to necessarily be in a charity or a big organisation. Why don't I do this? And the thing is, there are moments where you think, do I quit it? And you get so many people coming in and saying, the amount of knowledge you've built up about this system will just disappear. And this fight will be lost for a generation. So I'm 30. Obviously, I'd like a real job. But there's an element of we're piercing the skin now. We're getting into the belly of the beast. We get that intimidation. That actually cheers me on because I know that what I've done is upset people. And actually, the thing is, we don't want to bring down the Labour government. We don't want to bring down developers. People should be allowed to make money, but make it in a fair way. Give people a product that they want to buy into, that they have full control over, like they do in Scotland and the rest of the world with common hold systems. And I think for me, I'm not leaving this space until it's done. until Labour get rid of it, and it might unfortunately not be Labour.
Sounds like a threat, no?
No, it's just,
Okay.
there's an element of, if I'm not doing it, no one else will.
Yeah.
And it's almost like people are really, throwing their weight behind the campaign, because there are other groups out there. They've done great work to get us this far. But what's happening is it's the photo ops with the politicians. It's meeting the civil servants. It's being inside the tent.
Yeah.
For me, I don't feel that gets to change, because I've done that.
Yeah.
And I think also growing up in Singapore, a highly, autocratic political culture, I'm a political animal. Yeah. And the fact is that you've got to fight this campaign as a political issue, not necessarily as a policy or a technical issue. Because as soon as you go into the policy and technical, as you said yourself, people switch off. You've got to make it about people. You've got to make it about what's going on, and you've got to make it about politicians delivering for us.
And let's talk about delivering. Do you think the Labour Party now are delivering?
No. So, and I hate to say it, because I went and actually, in a personal capacity, campaigned for them at the election, because I was thinking the Tories let us down on this.
Are you disappointed?
Massively with where Labour are now, absolutely. And I think the thing is, we're now in a world where, people are moving to the political extremes. You've got the rise of populism. People don't just want to feel heard. Yeah. They want politics as performance. They want to see that you're delivering. Yeah. And I think with Labour at the moment, particularly on this issue, they're not seeing it. They're not seeing the change. They're not feeling it. And anytime there is an announcement, it feels like we've had to basically draw blood out of a stone. And that shouldn't be from the party that has historically been about economic fairness and taking on the vested interests. People don't want this sort of uni-party where it feels like the Tories and Labour are the same thing. And I think on this issue alone, we have many supporters that were lifelong Conservative voters who defected to Labour on their manifesto pledge to get rid of leasehold. And you had others that were lifelong Tories that voted reform, but there were others that stayed at home. And those people that also voted Labour are now saying they're not big fans of reform, but their only power is their vote. Yeah. So even though we might be 4 years out from election, that is the conversation we're having with people, where they're going, we've got nowhere else to go. And I think what's interesting is there's this debate now going on with the government, where you've got the people that are saying they're the insurgents, like the Morgan McSweeneys of this world, Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. And then you've got the more computer says no, Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, where it's all about process. And it's all this kind of drawing it out. And I think people want more of this sort of robust approach, because, Keir's even said it. If the Labour government cannot change the system for working people, the voters will vote for a party or politicians that will change the system. I think that's so fascinating at the moment, that dynamic. And leasehold, getting rid of it, is all at that debate. We were saying months before this became a thing where the government seems obsessed with consultations. Sometimes you've got to change the system, and that means if you believe something is morally right, you believe it's for the people, you're going to fight everyone. Fight even the civil servants. Have a row. Be a bit of a populist of your own. Go and say, we're doing it. We don't care. So at the moment, there's a big At the moment, there's a big legal fight that's going on with the big freeholders. They're suing the government to block legislation passed by the last government on leasehold. And they're crowing about the human rights. And it's a judicial review. And obviously the government, they seem a bit intimidated by it. But why can't the government have a row about it and say, actually, this isn't right? This is a law that was promised in the manifesto. We've also promised to deliver it in our King's Speech. The will of the people matters. And when Parliament has passed something that the people want, some rich people that don't benefit from policy shouldn't be allowed to sue the government's arse to stop it. Because I think what's going to happen is people will, and I don't say this with any glee, this is quite worrying, people will go to extreme politics. They will move away from the established order. And who's to blame for it? It will be Labour. And obviously the Tories before, they're as bad as each other. So if they don't do this, and I think the key thing is something as meaty as getting rid of leasehold, you've got to prioritise it, you've got to resource it. Because if you don't, you run out of political capital at the end of the 5 years of the term. And I think that's a huge issue.
Harry Scoffin for Housing Minister?
No way.
But that's how you make change, no?
No, because I think what happens is that unless you're the Prime Minister or maybe the Chancellor, you don't really have that control over the policy. And I think the thing is, it's much...
So you want to be PM?
No, not saying that at all. No way, no.
You know.
You know what? And people sometimes ask me this, and I say, I've just got one thing.
Yeah.
Get leasehold done. Get it abolished. And these politicians...
So what happens to you after? If that is abolished, if it is abolished, what do you do next?
I want to do something that's very oriented around campaigns, people. Maybe something policy, because I think what's interesting about our campaign, and people say it to me, and I normally don't say it, but you've got me on the show, I might as well. We mix politics with policy. Yeah. So we're doing these videos at the moment where we're trying to distill very complicated ideas into a few minutes.
I mean, it's a very complicated topic. Even researching it myself, I just found myself in endless just words and just didn't understand what was going on. I'm quite young. But how do you describe it to someone who is, 19, 20, who doesn't know much about this, but who will have to face this when they're older?
Because I think
in a simple way.
Simple way is: do you want to be a glorified rental tenant with a mortgage attached, and actually have no control over the running costs of your home? Because if you want to be in a form of financial servitude, sign up to a leasehold property. And I think that's the key thing. That actually, I think for our generation, we're priced out of home ownership anyway. But even the lucky ones, they're only really going to be able to afford a flat. They're not going to be able to afford a house. So even the lucky ones are getting screwed. That's not right. And it's not like, oh, you just made a bad investment decision. This is like what your whole life is geared around, about actually putting roots down, having security and having autonomy. And I know that whole line about take back control, but Labour appropriated it themselves. People don't feel, especially our generation, that we've got control over our own lives. And I think for so many generations, people are like, you have to have a home of your own. And what's so annoying is that the generations ahead of us, so my parents, grandparents, all the rest of it, they took freehold ownership for granted. And I think what for me really strikes at the unfairness is that you've got all of these people now in political power. I'm not saying this government, but it's a trend where they go, well, you just got to make do. No, the rest of the world doesn't make do with leasehold. They all have fairer systems. Why can't we get with the programme? And I think for me, this is such an unfairness. This will be filed against the sub-post, alongside the sub-postmasters, the infected blood. This is up there as one of the great injustices of this country. And the fact is that successive politicians have promised to get rid of it and then they don't. And I think that's where there has to be a wider debate about who calls the shots in our democracy. Is it the people that donate to the political parties? And I think, there needs to be a wider discussion about how to reform that whole system. Because at the moment, someone said to me the other week, they said, your campaign is a symptom of a broken political system. And he took the words out of my mouth. I agree with him. I shouldn't exist. Free leaseholders shouldn't exist. And it's sad that we're doing the work of MPs, we're doing the work of ministers, we're doing the work of civil servants, we're doing the work of the Prime Minister when we shouldn't need to, because they've got the power, we don't. I think that's the key thing. And I really, really want to make a really important point here, is that these vested interests don't just necessarily donate to political parties, but they also employ lobbying companies to do the work that I'm doing for free, by the way. And they're, lavishing money on these guys. And they're the ones that are meeting MPs. They're the ones meeting civil servants. They're the ones meeting ministers, people in number 10 in the Treasury. And that is a huge issue. And it's not just on leasehold. This is happening on every single policy area. And I think even seeing who ministers have met with, that is not regularly updated. Yeah. That's a huge thing. And I think... You
think we need a reform?
Whole political reform, root and branch, because right now it's not working for the people, and it's working for the people that are doing very well out of this status quo. Yeah. And I think that's why we're getting people that are getting so angry that they are looking at, the Greens on the left, reform on the right, or maybe altogether something more sinister that will come that we don't know about. The fact is that's what's happening. And I think Labour in the last chance saloon. Because if they can't show meaningful change to people's lives now, and they say, well, wait 4 to 5 years, people will tune out by that point. And they will have made up their minds and they'll go elsewhere. And I think that's a huge thing. I think capitalism only works when people have capital. And for leasehold, you don't own the land. There have been civil wars over land ownership. Yeah, you don't own a brick. You don't own a single pane of glass. And you've got a landlord. And I think that is so unfair. And the fact that the governments have all said that they're going to do this, but a lot of the work's been done. Law Commission over half a decade ago. Why? If we put man on the moon, we got COVID jabs into people's arms like that, beating a lot of the rest of the continent. Why can't we do it? And I think also the government go on about growth. And I'm sure you're very interested, a bit younger than me, about the YIMBY movement and build. And but all of these guys fetishize blocks of flats. On Twitter they go, here's a beautiful block in central London, all of that. But what they're not actually saying is that until we get rid of leasehold, flat living's never going to take off. So we've got the second lowest proportion of flats of any housing stock in the whole of Europe after Ireland. Now, why is Ireland worse than we are? They inherited leasehold from us. So the Irish didn't want to be subjugated by landlords. So that's just their legacy from British Empire. The fact is that we've got to get with a programme. We've got to make sure, because at the moment, people should live closer to work. I know there's a whole work from home trend, but that's changing. So we have to work closer. We have to live closer to work and actually enjoy the benefits that city living brings. And at the moment, we're locking a whole generation out of housing in general. But even the ones that can afford, you're saying you're a glorified rental tenant with a mortgage attached.
I mean, you take the words out of my mouth. Let's talk about housing more generally, if we can. You're seeing the cost of living crisis. Where has our country gone wrong when it comes to housing, rents, just everything? Where have we gone wrong?
I think what's happened is that people have sort of decided that the housing is like an asset and not something where you put a family in it and that you grow and you live with it. And I think that this sort of monetization, financialization of housing has become such a thing. And, yes, the Labour government is going after buy-to-let landlords as small-timers, but then you're also seeing in the same breath, huge amounts of money is going into build-to-rent. And I think that's a really dangerous model because those rents only go one way up, sometimes linked with RPI. That's not necessarily a good deal for people. And, a lot of these guys, they're offshore companies. And I think there has to be a whole debate. And yes, you've got to build. But another big debate that's going on at the moment.
But some people would argue that is what capitalism is. And that is the world we live in.
Well, the question is who owns the property, and that for me is as important as let's build. I think if you're allowing people to actually own their own home, that's one thing. But if you're peddling really toxic schemes like leasehold, like shared ownership, even like build to rent, because that will become that's a ticking time bomb already. That's going to be a big issue. I think then we have to have a discussion, and I think that is the worry that. And Quaja is very good on this, that it's almost like we've basically made this an asset class when actually it should be quite boring. It should be like Germany where housing, all these articles for years is about house price growth. That's not healthy, but I also get, and this is where I probably disagree with Quajo, is that for our generation, yes, there has to be more social housing. That waiting list is huge, like 1.5 million. But you also need to allow our generation to buy their own home, because if we don't have that property wealth, we're in big trouble when we come to retire, because we're not going to have that equity to draw down on. So the thing is, there's so many different debates here. And another thing, and it's going to make me unpopular with the IMBY crowd, but this idea that developers are necessarily the answer to the housing crisis, I don't think is necessarily correct. These guys, they've got foreign shareholders. They're not necessarily signed up to some national mission to deal with the housing crisis. They care about extracting rents. And there's lots of literature on it, academic literature as well, which says that these sort of volume house builders, they don't care about volume. They care about yield and margin. So actually, if they could build fewer properties for more, they will. And Janet Daly, the head of Taylor Wimpey, she's even come out and said, we're not going to build so much that what we ask for those properties has to come down. We're not. So they control the supply. So I think.
So what is the answer then, if it's not developers?
I think we need to promote a lot more small and medium-sized builders who got wiped out in the global financial crisis, because those guys, they are literally looking at like a plot of land.
Hearing you talk about this, it's a much bigger problem, isn't it? You're talking about this now, but we've got, Rachel Reeves, just no one wants to start businesses anymore. It's a whole societal thing in our country. Yeah. It's broken.
Absolutely.
The system is broken.
And I think it starts with housing, not to bring it back, but it does, because when you're spending like half of your income on rent or even more, you've not got any money to put into the real economy. And it's the same in leasehold. Hampton, £7.6 billion leaseholders were paying in service charges in flats last year. That is not money that's going into the high street. That's not money that's going in starting a family. That is not money setting up a business. They talk about growth, animal spirits. None of that's going to happen when you are worried about your next rent payment or your next service charge payment. And I think that's so key. But the problem is that the ones that do so well out of the broken housing market are the ones that are funding think tanks, that are funding lobbyists, that are funding research, that then goes to Number 10, that then goes to the Treasury, that then goes to MHCLG, the housing department. It's a structural issue. And the fact is that campaigns like ours, where we are trying to redress the balance, there's no money, there's no funding, this is literally just doing it for the goodness of the society, that's not sustainable. And I think that's a real big debate we have to have, is that getting people that can actually push transformative policies, that government can come and turn around and say, we're going to deliver that. And I think also at the moment now, when there's not much money around for the government, they want quick wins. And I've got to bring it back. Quick win is ending leasehold, because that is just taking money out of the economy. And it's just an entirely unnecessary rent extraction industry. We don't need it. And I think, obviously with rental, there's obviously really strong debates on rental side that if you go too hard on the buy-to-let landlords, they're going to leave the market and you'll have even fewer properties and rents will then go up. Now, or rent controls. And, I'm not 100% sure of my views on that yet, but we'll obviously have to wait and see now with this renters' rights bill that's coming in. But I think, yes, you need supply. But beyond that, we've also got to make sure that we're not building terribly built properties, because that's another huge scandal waiting to blow, where, you've actually got more consumer rights buying a kettle or a toaster, white goods in this country, than a home. Yeah. So if anything goes wrong, you could be basically facing a wipeout bill to remediate a building that you had no say over its construction. Yeah. That's another thing. And then also, relatedly, there is an issue now on houses that are freehold, called leasehold. So you buy a freehold house, you think you're free of hold and you've got control, then you're locked into a management company that you can't fire. So it's there are parallels with leasehold there. That affects over about 1.5 million households. That's only going to get worse now. So we've got to look at that as well. So you've just got so many different issues. But I think one thing that I'm going to say, and I don't understand why Labour aren't doing it, because it's so popular, why don't they do a swinging tax on overseas buyers? I know they bring it up just by a few percentage points. It's not right if we're building all these homes. And there's a really good piece in the Times recently by Melissa York, which is about a Singaporean investor. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a really good piece. A Singaporean investor who's done really, really well out of the UK property market. And she was asked, do you feel guilty? She said, no. Your country is quite unusual in the world, that is so porous, that allows people like me to bring in the whole of Southeast Asia to basically buy up whole blocks off plan. That isn't right. So they need to take that on as well, because yes, we need more supply, but we've got to cool demand.
Harry, it's a big conversation to have, and I mean, we're just getting into the crux of it really here. And one last question to you. Would you support a Labour government that supports policy on capping service charge?
No, because the problem with capping service charge is that if repairs need to be done, and they are a certain cost, you're then basically saying, let the building fall to rack and ruin. What we need to do is give leaseholders control. And that means right to manage, but beyond that, an easier process to convert to common hold or buying the freehold.
There's an argument about what about all the investment companies that are wrapped up in this already? If the government policy is to change, what happens there?
It's absolute rubbish. So this thing about...
I mean, they wouldn't argue it's rubbish. They would say, no, we've signed these contracts. We own this building. We're not going
But Parliament has gone through the generations changing contract terms when they think they're unfair. You've got unfair contract terms legislation, consumer rights. Unfortunately, leasehold has always been excluded from that as an issue. And actually, I really want to delve very quickly on the pensions point. This thing was a smokescreen that was erected under the last government when Michael Gove wanted to get rid of ground rents. And actually, one of the leading trade associations originally said it's not an issue. And obviously, they presumably had faced a backlash from these freehold investors. They changed their position. But basically, pension funds are invested less than 5% in UK property. And that's not just residential, that's commercial. They are highly globally diversified funds. They are not involved in residential ground rent. So they're hoping that people that are time poor in the media, producers, MPs and ministers, won't actually go into the weeds of this. And the fact is that we got rid of things like a tithe. And the Church of England thought they had some divine right to a tithe, to actually own the fruits of our labour. We can get rid of ground rent and leasehold. And I think that's the key thing, that we don't have to have it. And I think that one other point that I want to make is that our campaign has been so strong that we are not asking for the freeholds for free. Leaseholders will have to compensate the freeholders. All we're saying is that the process must change to no longer stuff with their mouths of gold.
Harry, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks.
And thank you very much for listening and watching. The Memo's back soon. Thank you.